Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Hasan Alhasan, a research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies based in Manama, Bahrain. Prior to joining IISS, he served for 5 years on the staff of the Crown Prince of Bahrain as a senior analyst on foreign policy and national security. Together, we compare Gulf states' foreign policies and their underlying strategies. Then I continue the conversation with Todman and Leah Hickert to discuss how Gulf states handle shifts in U.S. strategies and what the Gulf expects from its great power partners. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Hasan Alhasan, welcome to Babel.
Thank you very much.
Around the world, there's a war in Ukraine, U.S.-Chinese competition, there's a war in Gaza. You're sitting in the Gulf. What does it look like is going on around the world?
It's a very dangerous world. There is tremendous upheaval, as you describe it. The geopolitical situation in the region looks extremely turbulent, but obviously it's not much better in Europe at the moment. Global geoeconomics also look quite turbulent in the sense that you've got an ongoing trade war that could even get worse if Trump gets reelected. And all of these can have all kinds of repercussions for the Gulf region. But I think in addition, there is a tremendous amount of opportunity that Gulf leaders seem to perceive in this changing geopolitical and geoeconomic context, in the sense that it opens up opportunities for the Gulf states to play various roles that had been close to them in the past. And so you see the Saudis, for example, and the Emiratis trying to mediate various prisoner exchanges between the Russians and the Ukrainians. That's not a role that you would normally conceive for the Gulf states, but there they are. And I think they see this not only as a perilous environment, but also one that offers several opportunities.
So how would you differentiate the different approaches of Gulf states? What are the similarities? And you mentioned the Saudis and the Emiratis in one breath, talking about prisoner exchanges. But what are the differences in how Gulf states both perceive the world and how they act as they perceive that world?
I tend to think that the similarities are greater than the differences, in the sense that if you look at the crux of their foreign policies, of their threat perceptions, of their national security strategies, I see more similarities than differences. All of these are U.S. strategic partners. They rely on the presence of foreign powers, the United States first and foremost, to protect and safeguard their national interests. They perceive Iran to varying degrees as a source of potential threat. They are open economies. They are oil exporters. They are gas exporters. The similarities that bring them together are greater than the differences that set them apart. But obviously, there are significant differences. Historically, their relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood has been quite different. Their relationship with regional powers, such as Turkey and Iran, has also been different, at least on the tactical level, as far as Iran is concerned. So you have countries like Oman, like Qatar, even Kuwait to some extent, that have traditionally been more willing to engage with Iran, and they see that as being a more effective means of managing that large and potentially threatening neighbor. But you see differences as well in the relationship with Turkey, for example, where Qatar clearly has a very strong relationship with Turkey, and that aligns more or less as well with the fact that Qatar tends to be more permissive and open to the Muslim Brotherhood, at least on the regional level, obviously not within Qatar's domestic polity. And so in a sense, you do see these differences, and they can be significant. They have been very significant over the past decade, especially with the Arab Spring, which was a period very much characterized by rivalries and competition over who gets to exert more influence within the region and who gets to shape geopolitical outcomes.
And it also seems to me that their approaches to China have been different. Saudi Arabia seemed to be much more interested in getting closer to China before it became much less interested in getting closer to China. We've seen the United Arab Emirates seeming to get closer to China and then striking this deal on AI that seemed to align it more closely with the United States. How do countries differentiate their understanding both of a future relationship with the United States and a future relationship with China?
what brings all of the Gulf states together is sort of a realization that you can't really choose between any of these two partners, in the sense that there are strategic security interests with the United States. There are major economic interests with China, which ultimately is their largest oil market and also their largest economic partner in terms of trade. And also in Russia, in the sense that there is obviously a common interest in managing the oil markets. There is, again, a commonality in approach in not wanting to choose. None of the Gulf states have chosen to enforce Western sanctions against Russia, for example, precisely because they share in this realization. But I think beyond that, obviously, their appetite and their room for maneuver in engaging with China and even Russia differ quite significantly. So in the past, the UAE, until rather recently, had clearly taken the lead in establishing and positioning itself as China's most significant interlocutor in the Gulf. But Saudi Arabia has really grown a much bigger appetite for engaging with China. And you see that happening on multiple levels, at the scientific, technological, economic level, but also increasingly in defense. You see it now increasingly with Bahrain as well, which has recently struck a strategic partnership agreement with China, even though Bahrain was actually perhaps the slowest of the Gulf countries to really build a relationship with China. Oman obviously also has an interest. It's the only Gulf state to have received soft loans from China to support its budget, and obviously relies massively on the Chinese market for oil exports. But the pace of diplomatic relations varies somewhat, with Kuwait and Qatar being slower to build a more robust relationship with the Chinese.
How much fear is there that a relationship with China in certain fields will undermine the relationship with the United States? And how much expectation is there that China will fill some of the gap that a less intimate relationship with the United States would create? And how much fear is that gap would be wider because China simply won't do what the United States can do and has been willing to do?
It is a complex dynamic, and I don't think the Gulf states see it as a very clean trade-off, in the sense that China has acted opportunistically, and so have the Gulf states. And so, for example, the Gulf states wanted armed UAVs or drones from the United States. When they couldn't get them, they turned to the Chinese, but also obviously to others like the Turks. The Gulf states are going to get however much they can get from whoever they can get it from. And so if they really want something, whether it's a piece of military hardware or assistance on AI or semiconductors, I think they have proved to be very dogged and sort of pragmatic in their resolve. Now, obviously, the United States has tried to impose certain trade-offs. And so, for example, by conditioning access to certain emerging and disruptive technologies deemed critical to U.S. national security over a curtailing of relations with China in those fields. I think the Gulf states have successfully pushed back against U.S. pressure when it comes to involving Huawei in 5G telecommunications infrastructure.
Though the U.S. was concerned about Huawei and it interrupted the F-35 sale to the Emirates, and there still hasn't been an F-35 sale to the Emirates.
The interesting thing is that tells you actually quite a bit about the UAE decision-making and why the UAE decided to still press ahead with Huawei despite the risk of foregoing the F-35 deal. And I think that's part of the pushback that I describe against not wanting to comply with the zero-sum equation that the US is trying to impose. Now, obviously, in certain areas like AI, where the United States continues to have an advantage over China, I think you'll see the Emiratis very pragmatically decide to align with the United States there. The Saudis, I think, have been somewhat more on the fence. And what I wouldn't be really surprised to see is sort of a two-systems approach, where certain, let's say, sovereign wealth funds or state-owned enterprises might align with the US, whereas education institutions might seek cooperation with the Chinese. You might really start seeing this kind of behavior in order to try and maximize the benefits from engaging with both parties.
We've seen a call in the Gulf to have very formal written agreements with the United States on defense issues without an accompanying commitment that in a world that seems to be bifurcating, that Gulf states are casting their lot firmly with the United States. Is that a concern, that this idea of what you might call positive neutrality becomes unsustainable in an increasingly divided world?
That's a great question, but it's really a matter of perspective. I think the Gulf states see it rather differently, in the sense that I think they see a credible threat of edging closer to China as constituting a really useful bargaining leverage vis-a-vis the United States. The Gulf states don't really think that the US would be seriously interested in deepening its defense and security commitment to them, had the United States not thought that failing to do so wouldn't really have an impact on the Gulf states' appetites for engaging with China. The United States has been rather vocal in its concerns about a potential Chinese military footprint in the Gulf, including in Abu Dhabi or even in Oman. And so I think the Gulf states are somewhat dexterous at actually using those concerns to essentially say, if the United States doesn't formalize its commitment, then, well, the Gulf states will find different ways of achieving what it's trying to do. So I think they see this actually as a point of leverage. But obviously, it's a very delicate balance, because if they go too far with China in certain domains, then obviously the risk is that could backfire and end up undermining the US security commitment.
We've talked about China, we've mentioned Russia, we haven't mentioned a country you know a lot about, which is India. Are we underestimating the future role of India? People talk about India as a strong middle power becoming, some Indians see it, a weak great power. India's involvement in the Gulf has been growing. As we think about the geopolitics of the Gulf, do we need to pay more attention to the changing role of India and how that plays out?
If anything, there's been a degree of overexcitement in Washington about the potential role that India could play in the Middle East region and the Western Indian Ocean, so to speak. The idea that the US could create a network of partners connecting and knitting together partners in the Indian Ocean with partners in the Middle East. And we've seen that manifest itself in I2U2, which brings together India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, with IMEC, or the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which is supposed to be this essentially multimodal transport and trade corridor linking India to Europe through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. So I think betting on a larger role for India has actually been somewhat of a hallmark of this present administration's approach to the Middle East. But I think at this point in time, India has little to offer, in the sense that India doesn't have really much capital to put on the table. It's actually looking to attract investments from the Gulf. It doesn't yet have the willingness really to be a full security partner for the United States in the region. So yes, it's now become an observer at the Combined Maritime Forces, but it's not yet a fully participating member. That partially has to do with the fact that India doesn't like to follow the US's lead when it comes to security and defense constructs in the Indian Ocean, but also because of obviously Pakistan's membership of the Combined Maritime Forces. But beyond that, India's foreign policy in the region has not evolved to such an extent. It doesn't have the toolkit that would position it to really be an influential player that could shape geopolitical outcomes in a way consistent, for example, with US foreign policy, but even in a way really that makes a significant difference to the region. Not just yet, at least.
That's very interesting. I wonder if another piece of that, which is that you certainly have India-China tensions, and India might see the Gulf as a way to address some of its challenges, competition with China. Is there a way that could have an impact on the situation in the Gulf, or is it really they have so few tools that it's just not impactful?
No, I do think India really is concerned about China's growing influence in the Gulf. They tend to see it within the framework of a so-called string of pearls policy, the idea that China could end up encircling India and the Indian Ocean by building ports and dual-use infrastructure that it could weaponize in times of war. And they see Chinese investments in ports like Duqm, the UAE, and potentially even in Iran, when the Iranians seem to be playing hardball with the Indians on Chabahar port, which is a port that the Indians were supposed to be developing for over 2 decades now, but had faced obstacles partly due to US sanctions. And the Iranians had played hardball at some point by threatening to bring in the Chinese on various contracts. And that obviously spooked the Indians. So I think India does have a great deal of concern about what they perceive to be China's growing influence in the region. Now, I do think India's concerns are also exaggerated because I don't think China is going to be able to force a geopolitical outcome on the region that countries in the region did not want in the first place. China doesn't have that kind of leverage over the Gulf states. But I don't think that India really at this point is willing or able to expend a lot of diplomatic capital, and nor I think is it able to at this point do anything to stem China's growing influence in the Gulf region.
But I also wonder about China's willingness to expend diplomatic capital. We certainly haven't seen China play a very active role in Red Sea security, despite the fact not only that so much Chinese trade passes through the Red Sea, but that China has put a big investment in Egypt, and Suez Canal tolls are down 57% since January. We haven't seen Chinese diplomacy on Gaza being meaningful at all. As the Gulf thinks about its security issues, it seems to me that China's been remarkably passive on precisely the issues that are most important to Gulf states. Is that having an impact?
I think it does. I don't think the Gulf states really by any measure are expecting or would even want for China to play a game-changing role in Middle Eastern geopolitics. I don't think they trust China enough yet for it to play a much larger security role or really to evolve into the kind of strategic partner that the US is. But I think they do see China as a marginal, useful and opportunistic player. And so if the Saudis can get China to broker a deal to restore diplomatic relations with Iran, then fantastic, because clearly the US is either unwilling or unable to do so. If the Saudis and Emiratis can attract Chinese investments into their oil and critical infrastructure, and by doing so give the Chinese a vested interest in Saudi and Emirati stability, and by doing so restrain Iran, then that's all the better. And if China can act as a useful diplomatic partner in the UN Security Council and vote in a certain way on the Palestinian issue, then that's also great. The point is that it's very much opportunistic. I don't think there is a great deal of expectation being placed by the Gulf states on the kind of diplomatic or security role that the Chinese can play. The limits of China's appetite are clear to everyone in the region.
Until about a year ago, every time I went to the Gulf, people would tell me the U.S. is on its way out the door, the U.S. is abandoning us, the U.S. has lost its interest in the Gulf. Since October 7th, I haven't heard that at all. I think we've seen Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea be a sign of the U.S. willingness to fight on behalf of global security issues in the Middle East. What has happened to the concern about a U.S. withdrawal? What are people's judgments about the U.S. commitment to the region, and how is the region responding as a consequence of what we've seen for the last 9 months?
So pre-October 7, I largely agree with you in the sense that there's been a series of disappointments in the Gulf about the extent of the U.S.'s security commitment, not necessarily the level of troops or military equipment that it maintains in the region. That hasn't changed tremendously, but really the extent of what the U.S. is willing to do with the firepower that it has amassed in the region. And I think there are two important watershed moments of late, one of which is the 2019 Iranian attacks on the Saudi Aramco oil facilities and the Houthi attacks on Abu Dhabi. And I think the lukewarm U.S. response, the U.S.'s unwillingness to use military power to respond, was seen with a large degree of disappointment. That was an important moment in prompting a Gulf rethinking of their own approaches really to managing regional threats. It's this disappointment that is partly responsible for the de-escalation we saw between the Gulf states and their regional rivals. So the resolution of the crisis with Qatar, but also the repairing of relations with Turkey and even with Iran. Now, I think there is no doubt in anyone's mind in the region that the U.S. is willing to use firepower and military power and is willing to fight on behalf of Israel. And I think this is how the U.S.'s intervention in the Red Sea is being perceived. It's also partly the reason why none of the Arab states, none of the Gulf states, no Muslim majority country, with the sole exception of Bahrain, decided to participate in Operation Prosperity Guardian or decided to then support the US-led attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, because these are perceived squarely as being efforts on behalf of Israel. The Israel-Hamas war has, I think, set the US-GCC strategic partnership on a more equal footing. I think in the past, the risk of entanglement was always perceived by Washington, in the sense that Washington had always been reticent and hesitant to upgrade its defense and security commitment to the Gulf states, for fear that the Gulf states would prove to be more reckless vis-a-vis Iran and could end up really dragging the US into a war with Iran. The interesting thing is that I think the perception is now being reversed, in the sense that the Gulf states see the US as being hostage to Israeli decision-making, which I think has proved very reckless over the past few months, and that ultimately it's Israel through the US that could end up dragging the Gulf states into a war with Iran that they do not want. That explains why the Gulf states have chosen to preserve these diplomatic relations and have chosen to protect the de-escalatory dynamic with Iran. It's part of the reason why the Gulf states chose not to put on an offensive posture by lending their support to Operation Prosperity Guardian or to the US-led strikes against the Houthis. It also explains why there's been a degree of reporting about the United Arab Emirates restricting the use of their territory and airspace to the US in order to prevent the United States from using their territory to launch attacks against the Houthis in Yemen or even against targets in Iraq, and why the Gulf states have been asking the United States not to use Gulf-based bases or airspace to launch attacks against Iran. There is, I think, a realization now that after, as you say, years of concern of US abandonment, that actually the relationship is now on a more equal footing. The US needs its partnerships and relationships with the Gulf states, partly to deter Iran and to preserve Israel's security. These relationships have proved extremely important in allowing and enabling the United States to blunt Iran's attacks against Israel. And there aren't many other partners that can offer the United States the same amount of room for maneuver and safe space to operate as the Gulf states in the Middle East region. As you know, this is a highly contested region. And so I think there is this really interesting realization and reshaping of the dynamic that is coming out of the current war between Israel and Hamas.
As you note, regional states helped defend Israel against an Iranian attack in April. No country that's been part of the Abraham Accords has walked away from that. There seems to be an expectation that relations with Israel will pick up, and I think a similar expectation that relations with Iran will be sustained. It feels to me like the Gulf is trying to have it both ways, to sustain relations with Iran and grow relations with Israel, with a sense that you can sustain relations with the United States and grow relations with China. What are the trade-offs from trying to have it both ways?
Yes, I think the Gulf states are trying to have their cake and eat it at the same time. And the way they do this is by maintaining a rather delicate balance on certain issues. For example, you mentioned what the Gulf states have done by way of intercepting Houthi UAVs and Houthi missiles, but also in assisting the US intercept the direct attack launched by Iran on Israel. Now, I think the Gulf states would, although they haven't articulated this, so this is purely my own personal interpretation, would say that they are adopting a purely defensive posture in the sense that they're intercepting projectiles that are crossing over their territories and that they're not really presenting a threat to Iran. The Iranians seem to accept this as a compromise that they're willing to live with. So I think it's really by threading the needle that the Gulf states are trying to manage these trade-offs between having good relations with Israel and with Iran at the same time. This was actually the thrust of Gulf foreign policy prior to October 7. You had the Emiratis, the Saudis talk about a shared prosperity agenda, this old idea that through economic interconnections, through investments in connectivity, infrastructure, trade, that ultimately the interests of all of the different countries in the region can be intertwined, and this could have a peace-inducing effect. you have the war now. It's seen as somewhat of a spoiler, but not necessarily as a total game changer for the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia obviously sees an opportunity. They see themselves as having greater leverage to negotiate a binding U.S. defense commitment in exchange for normalization of relations with Israel, because they know that essentially the Saudi normalization agreement with Israel is part of the off-ramp strategy that the Biden administration is trying to construct for Benjamin Netanyahu, to say that if you end the war, that there would be an upside of establishing a diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis know this. They know that President Biden is pressed for time. He's obviously facing a looming election. And so they see this as an opportunity to get a deeper defense commitment from the United States. Ultimately, the Gulf states are obviously still interested in sustaining all of these relationships. They manage these trade-offs by walking various fine lines and striking delicate balances. Sometimes these balances can go wrong, but at the moment, their strategies, I think, are paying off, although they have to be more realistic about the pace at which they will be able to deepen their relationship with Israel. I think grand connectivity projects are likely to become much less achievable, and I think the Gulf states know this.
Threading the needle is one thing with the Biden administration. It could be something very different with the Trump administration. One of the problems that all the Gulf states have is that you can have profound changes in strategy in the United States every 4 or 8 years. Will the way the Gulf states are threading the needle now likely suffice in a Trump administration, which may have much less tolerance for balance, may be much more aggressive about Iran's regional role? How do the Gulf states think about the necessary agility if the U.S. political context changes dramatically?
I think this is a strategic dilemma for the Gulf states, probably one of their greatest strategic challenges that I think you described so eloquently. Their single most important strategic security partner, the United States, is liable to changing its mind about how to approach Iran every 4 years or so. You went from a potential grand bargain under President Obama to maximum pressure under President Trump, and back to a more limited, arms control focused type of approach under President Biden. And arguably, Iran has been the most volatile foreign policy issue for the United States. The way the Gulf states have approached this initially was to voice their discontent with U.S. policy. And you might recall during the Obama administration how the Gulf states were really trying to influence the discussion, I think in vain, trying to prioritize the issues of Iran's regional proxy network over the issue of constraining Iran's nuclear program. And I think they failed rather dramatically in moving the U.S. needle on this issue under the Obama administration. I think the main lesson learned for the Gulf states is that you need an insurance policy. And you take out an insurance policy by building a direct relationship with Iran, partly because U.S. deterrence efforts vis-a-vis Iran have not been extremely successful below a certain threshold. The Iranians have been getting away with having partner and proxy groups in Iraq and Syria launch attacks on U.S. forces without incurring a serious U.S. military response. I recall a testimony by the CENTCOM commander where he said that there had been north of 70 attacks launched on U.S. service members in Iraq and Syria, and only on 3 or 4 occasions, I think, if I'm not misquoting him, the U.S. responded. There was a perception of U.S. deterrence failure vis-a-vis Iran, and there was, I think, a maturing of Gulf foreign policy on Iran, where even the Saudis and the Bahrainis and everyone else sort of realized the need to build and to engage Iran diplomatically, but also by bringing in new partners into the fold, like China, and engaging with the Russians, even when no one else in the Western world would, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and using those relationships to constrain Russian and Chinese relations with Iran, and also to attempt to build a degree of restraint. And so really it's managing this instability, this volatility in U.S. policy. And I think we're going potentially to see more volatility with the Trump administration. It's very difficult to predict what the Trump policy on Iran is going to look like. But I think the main lesson learned for the Gulf states is that you manage volatility by taking offsetting positions, by taking out an insurance policy, by building a direct relationship with the Iranians, and by building relations with Iran's main allies and benefactors, namely the Chinese and the Russians. I think this is how, by and large, the Gulf states have approached what I think has been one of their largest strategic challenges.
Hasan Alhasan, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you for having me.
According to Dr. Alhasan, Gulf states have been pushed to diversify their international relationships because U.S. strategy varies so much from administration to administration. Is there anything the United States should do or even can do to minimize this?
It seems to me that the change between administrations is getting much greater in the last 20 years. During the Cold War, not only did you have relative continuity, but you really had a concept that politics ends at the water's edge, and there should be a U.S. foreign policy that is consistent from administration to administration. Not only do I not see that as a value, I see it as a bug. If you wouldn't have a profoundly different foreign policy. Some of this, I think, started during the Cold War and Ronald Reagan, but it really feels to me like with the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, it was a central pillar of the campaign and of the government that foreign policy should be really different. For governments in the Middle East, which in their ideal world have virtually no change in personnel. And you've had Saudi ministers who served literally for 48 years in their position. The idea of dealing with a constantly fluctuating United States is an increasing challenge for them. You can certainly do some things by having treaties, but the United States government is much less good at entering treaties. And I'm not sure what kind of treaties we can actually enter into. So it seems to me that you can make commitments. We've made 10-year commitments to Israel for aid that subsequent administrations have honored. But it feels to me that in many ways, the U.S. government has gotten out of the treaty business. And if you're out of the treaty business and you're going to have that fluctuation, the consequence is you have to deal with governments that say, we're going to have to hedge because we have no idea where you're going to be in 5 years, and you don't know where you're going to be in 5 years.
Yeah, I think when you talk about what can the US do, it's worth thinking, who do we mean in the US? It's natural to focus on the president and on the administration, but Congress does have a role to play, and it's playing less of a role in treaties. It's also playing less of a role in trying to shape US foreign policy. Another actor here is the civil service, the administrative body of the US government. And I think they have, to some degree, played a sort of stabilizing role for US policy in the region. I mean, President Trump tried to withdraw twice from Syria, and it didn't happen either times. And so clearly they have some ability to push back. But whether that will remain the case going forward is now more of a discussion. So I think if you can't have these long-term commitments, the best thing probably is to have more of a national debate about what real interests are. And the piece I would slightly disagree with you, Jon, about the fluctuations in recent years, there are many tenets of the US strategy that have actually remained relatively stable, from President Obama to President Trump to President Biden. When you talk about less emphasis on the military footprint in the region, less engagement with Iran, certainly under the last two administrations, a similar stance on Israel as well. I think there haven't been that great swings, perhaps with the exception of Iran. But now maybe we're seeing some more debates within the main political parties. So the Democrats are starting to have more of an internal discussion about what the future of the US-Israeli relationship looks like. And then on the Republican side, there's much more of a conversation about an isolationist foreign policy where parts of the Republican Party still would like to see a more assertive US role in the world. So while in some ways I think we haven't seen as huge shifts as there could have been between administrations, perhaps there are more coming down the road.
And certainly I think there are areas where you have seen consistency through administrations on issues like India, which I think has enjoyed decades of increasing bipartisan interest. One of the interesting things about the Trump administration strategy is that policy toward Europe used to be consistent and now doesn't seem to be consistent between administrations. Iran is such a difficult issue and has become very polarizing. Israel may become more polarizing. And just as you said, the perceived need to really draw down the U.S. military footprint, the persistence of desire for U.S. security umbrella in the region, the diversity and dynamism of threats in the region leads me to think that the Middle East is going to be more subject to volatility, more subject to a whole range of U.S. strategies toward the region over the next 10 years than is true of South Asia, Latin America, and Africa.
Right now, Gulf states are trying to balance their relationships with the United States, Russia, and China. How will that likely evolve?
Dr. Alhasan said that the Gulf states are having to walk a fine line, and I think that is going to become even more difficult as their relationships develop and deepen with these states. If they succeed in strengthening their relationships with the US and China and Russia, then I think the positive side for them is that they gain more freedom of movement. They are less beholden to one of those three players trying to exert red lines over the relationship that the Gulf states can have with one of the other two. But that could come with a cost of less protection from the United States. If it feels that it's no longer able to have the influence that it wants in the region, then it might think, well, this isn't worth our security commitment. There's a real risk of failure in balancing these relationships that you end up incurring the ire of one of them. If the Gulf states feel that they have to step back from their relationship with China, then China has various economic tools to retaliate. They could decrease their investment in the region. With the US, I think that could look like a lot more scrutiny on Capitol Hill about the relationships that the US has with the Gulf states, perhaps a reduction in a US military presence. So I think there are various ways that this could go wrong if they fail to maintain this really delicate balance.
But the other element of that is what the Gulf states want to do. And I think Gulf states are very attuned to what any of these powers can do for them. Russia has demonstrated it's not very good at fighting wars. After people in the Middle East thought Russia was very good at fighting wars in Syria, they start fighting a war in Ukraine, which turns out to be a disaster. I think Middle Eastern states look at the Chinese economy and they worry. And you look at the U.S. economy, not only is the U.S. economy growing, but you look at U.S. diplomacy, the U.S. security ability. It is clear that over the last 18 months, as Gulf states have looked at potential partners, there has been a turn toward the United States, not because of sudden newfound affection for the Biden administration, but because of an assessment that if you have to bet on a horse, not only now, but for years in the future, it's going to have to be the United States. You have to be cautious about China, although China is interesting and worth having ongoing discussions with. And I think increasing skepticism toward Russia. That's not based on what the United States is doing, except succeeding. The extent to which the United States is perceived as successful and able to project security, that makes the United States a better partner. The most important thing the United States can do is to demonstrate its capacity to be a functioning country. And sometimes we've had a problem with that, but there's a general performance issue which strongly influences the way all these countries deal with us and deal with our potential competitors.
I wonder if the Red Sea is a challenge to that view, though. If the US is unable to forge enough of a coalition to really combat the Houthis and to properly secure the Red Sea shipping lanes from what's a really relatively minor military force, then I wonder if that view is quite as rosy as you depict it to be.
During the interview, Dr. Alhasan said that Gulf states do not want China to play a transformational role in regional security. So, given that, what do Gulf states want from great powers like China and the United States?
I think they want to use China as a way to remind the United States they have other options. They would like to have investment from China. they would like to have contracts with China. Over the last 18 months or so, as these states have thought through their options, there really is a sense that there are limits to how much they'll get from China, just as there are limits of what they'll get from the United States. But they're comfortable with what they get from the United States. And if they had their druthers, their choice would be to continue getting what they have gotten from the United States and keep that model going for as long as they can, rather than creating a whole new model that involves the likelihood of the United States having a lesser role, trying to persuade the Chinese to have a role the Chinese don't really want to have, figuring out how to deal with Russia. I don't think they feel there's a really good alternative solution set, and they would like to preserve the existing one for as long as they can. I think there was a time several years ago when they said, nope, we're going to build towards something else. I think they've thought more deeply and some different events have sunk in. They're saying, let's try to fix what we got.
I agree. I think, Jon, in the interview, you used the word agility. And I think agility and options are really what the Gulf states are looking for. They want to be able to operate relatively independently, but in a stable and secure environment. And they know that they on their own are unable to create that stable and secure environment. So they want the great powers to be providing that, while also being able to have various potential partners to pursue any given interest that they have. And I think right now, to some degree, they have that. The example that Dr. Alhasan gave in terms of drones going to other countries when the US said no. So in my mind, that's their ideal sort of relationship in this shifting geopolitical environment.
They're trying to build some leverage, but they want to make sure they don't build so much leverage that the United States has a shift. That's sometimes a hard line to walk. And I think they're thinking in a more focused and strategic way about it. I don't think the United States has often thought about its leverage in as dynamic a way. And perhaps what's really happening is that both sides are evaluating alternatives, not with a desire of pursuing alternatives, but understand the alternatives and the other side's alternatives so they can reinforce the relationship that they've had. And that, I think, puts us in a different and perhaps even a healthier position than we've been.
Thank you for joining me, Jon and Will.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.